We've seen some pretty incredible ports come out of Activision over the past few years: the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy, the Spyro Reignited trilogy, and more recently Crash 4. Now, one of last year's most praised releases arrives on Switch with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. These are games that hold a place in the hearts of many Nintendo 64-era fans, and it feels like a natural fit to have them return to Switch. So how do these ports hold up? Well, today we'll pit the Switch against the best console version of this release, the Xbox Series X, to see how the Switch holds up against the very best the game has to offer. I think it's worth pointing out before we get into a breakdown of what's been downgraded, that the Switch version on its own looks pretty darn good. There are some instances with ports where you look at the game and you think, this looks good for a Switch version of a game not built for Switch. Doom Eternal is a good example of this. Tony Hawk is an example of a game that just looks good on Switch, without really having to throw out that for a Switch port caveat on top of it. So then, what's being sacrificed? Well, as we bring up our Series X footage, we're obviously working with a significantly lower resolution. There's a pass of some sort of anti-aliasing on it, which makes getting an exact count pretty difficult, but we're definitely looking at something sub 1080 by 1920. But the anti-aliasing really does a great job in most cases, at least in actual gameplay. When you're on the main menu just sort of staring down your character, the lower resolution is pretty obvious. But in motion, it looks great. Speaking of motion, we have of course made the jump from 60 frames per second down to 30, but that target of 30 frames per second is hit virtually without fault. If you're like me, and your point of reference for Tony Hawk is the N64 games, a smooth 30 feels pretty incredible compared to the 15 or so you'd be getting back in the day. Now, as for the finer details, puddles and reflective surfaces have had their real-time reflections swapped out for simpler, low-resolution cube maps. One of the more glaring changes is the harsh lowering of shadow resolution across the stages. It's particularly obvious in the opening warehouse level, where bright sunlight shines in from the windows, casting very distinct shadows on the ground. Distant lighting still looks fine, but up close, it's very pixelated. Honestly, I almost feel like a less detailed shadow, but with more smoothed off edges, might be preferable to these highly pixelated ones. That being said, overall, I'm impressed by how well the visual identity of these stages actually holds up. Textures are generally of a lower resolution, but materials are all extremely high quality, and at the lower rendering resolution of the game itself, those texture changes aren't particularly obvious. Some stages, like the Roswell stage, look remarkably close to its Series X counterpart. Occasionally you may find minor alpha effects like lens flares missing, though in general most alpha effects seem to still be in place. It's also worth noting that geometric detail appears to be a match in both versions, and some of the shortcuts I would have expected them to take actually weren't taken. Perhaps my favorite example of this is this game's tendency to show small rooms inside buildings. They're used constantly with varying degrees of detail. This would have been an easy place to simply make the windows opaque with a generic reflection map to them in order to save on polygons. But no, all of these rooms are present. This one in the downtown level from the first Tony Hawk gave me a chuckle in particular. It uses flat billboards to represent items inside the store, including a display that is set to always face the player. It's the same way trees worked in Super Mario 64. Using flat elements like this that always face the player was commonplace on the Nintendo 64, so seeing it still being used in a remake of an N64-era game over 2 decades later is, I don't know, heartwarming? I guess if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I expected this to be a much more aggressive downgrade, but honestly, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 doesn't just look good as a Switch port, it looks good as a Switch game. If you're a fan of classic Tony Hawk games and were questioning if this port could preserve the remaster on Switch, I don't think there's any doubt here. This is an excellent port, but if you're curious about the games themselves, keep an eye out for our full review, and subscribe to Nintendo World Report TV for much more. You can also join our Discord using the link in the description, and stick around for information on our Patreon. This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more. all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.